This is Julia Kempton, and this week's story is that the United Nations Development Program estimates that fossil fuel subsidies, with their environmental impacts, cost the world economy $6 trillion every year. We don't always think of the environment as directly relating to finance. Or let me restate that. I certainly hope you all do, but it's not always taught that way. Yet there is a direct relationship between the climate crisis and our studies in economics and finance. For those of us who are going on to work in banking or investment, you'll be faced with the question of whether or not to divest from corporations which profit off fossil fuels, and you'll need to deal with the increased risk and instability associated with climate change worsened weather events. Surely some of you will end up in the private sector, at tech firms, or in venture capital. Countless startups purport to solve the many issues that spring out of climate change. For those of us that go into policy fields or the public sector, the question of how to regulate polluting industries and react to extreme climate patterns, and the infrastructure damage, public health dangers, and refugee crises they will lead to, will surely be the principal issue of our generation. Given that, this subject is also timely. The 26th UN Climate Conference is meeting this week in Glasgow, bringing together representatives of United Nations members to discuss the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It has been heralded as a last chance for binding international frameworks to combat climate change, but it has also been criticized by some activists who feel that, like previous climate conferences, it will offer politicians an opportunity to say they did something by holding these discussions without actually making the changes they propose. In 2014, 196 countries signed on to the Paris Climate Accords, pledging drastic reductions in carbon emissions, but only 1 has stayed on track and only 8 have really gotten close. Tying this back to economic development, I want to talk about which countries have done better on sticking to their goals and which have done worse. By and large, developing economies and those in the global south have done a better job of mitigating their carbon emissions despite, with the exception of India, being relatively minor carbon emitters. That is, the US, China, Russia, and Western Europe produce a lot more carbon and a lot more pollution than anywhere else in the world, and with the exception of China, have for decades and decades. The G20 countries produce more than 3/4 of world emissions, yet advanced economies who have benefited from fossil fuels for decades now are asking those who are still developing not to use those same fuels, although they are cheaper and easier in the short term, and are more likely to renege on their own climate commitments. Nations with underdeveloped infrastructure are particularly vulnerable to climate change, as are coastal nations and those in the Pacific Ocean. Extreme heat waves and drought, exacerbated by climate change, have wrought havoc in the Middle East and in the Sahel, and are expected to worsen. But these are not the countries that hold the leverage in frameworks like the COP26 conference. Last week, the UNDP released a study which found that for every dollar pledged to tackle the climate crisis for the world's poor, $4 are spent on fossil fuel subsidies that keep the climate crisis alive. It said that the world spends an astonishing $423 billion annually to subsidize fossil fuels for consumers, oil, electricity that is generated by the burning of other fossil fuels, gas, and coal. The amount spent directly on these subsidies could pay for COVID-19 vaccinations for every person in the world, or pay for 3 times the annual amount needed to eradicate global extreme poverty. When indirect costs, including costs to the environment, are factored into these subsidies, the figure rises to almost $6 trillion, according to data recently published by the IMF. I know today's story doesn't give a direct thought on what new policies there are in sustainable development, but I do hope I've shared with you a significant piece of new research, which you'll keep in mind as COP26 deliberations proceed. In 4 or 5 years, we'll be out of school and really shaping financial policy. When we do, we ought to carefully weigh the short-term benefits of carbon emissions, and spending that subsidizes them, against their long-term dangers. In this context, we can relate this topic to the United Nations Development Programme's Sustainable Development Goal number 13, climate action. Now, on to the meeting.